Hello, everybody. In this video, I'm going to cover the idea of supporting your ideas within your speech. When you are looking for sources, you want to be sure that you're using strong supporting material. Speeches need this strong supporting material to bolster your point of view, make it seem like it's less opinionated and more fact-based. A speech that's composed of unsupported assertions can ultimately leave your audience skeptical and unconvinced. They might think that you're making things up or that they're not fully knowledgeable on the subject, so they wouldn't necessarily agree with you. Specific and credible details are more convincing than unsupported generalizations. We've talked about this in length before, where you don't want to make sweeping generalizations or vague statements. So you want to offer those very specific details that you've found to be credible. There are three major types of supporting material. The first one is examples. These are a really good way to get your audience involved with a speech because it's kind of more along the lines of painting a picture for people so that they can be there with you. Brief examples are very specific instances that a speaker refers to in passing. So just, a brief reflection. Here's this very short idea. Extended examples are stories, narratives, or anecdotes that you develop at more length than you would a brief example, and you do that to illustrate a point. Then hypothetical examples describe an imaginary or fictitious situation. So it would be asking your audience, can you imagine if, and then you fill in the blank, if this happened, etc. Some tips for using examples effectively. You want to use them to clarify your ideas. So let's say, for example, you do a presentation on suspension bridges, which I will imagine that no one will. You start describing them, talking about how they have beams and ropes that are supporting those beams. And it's not really tangible to us. We can't necessarily imagine what you mean. So instead, you could offer the example of a suspension bridge in specific, which the Golden Gate Bridge is one of them. And that's a very recognizable icon, so people can then much better understand what you're talking about. And in this case, having an actual picture of the Golden Gate Bridge would be very well used. You want to also use examples to reinforce your ideas, just kind of as a backup. Use them to personalize your ideas. This is where you get a little more creative. Use extended examples that are very vivid and richly textured. Give us a lot of depth, adjectives, details, etc. And then make sure that you practice your delivery a little bit more than usual to enhance the impact of extended examples, because your delivery is really going to make or break that example in terms of the expressiveness that you use, the nonverbal language, body gestures, hand gestures, etc. So the second major type of supporting material are statistics. When used properly, statistics are a really effective way to support your ideas. Having those things quantified, that really ultimately backs you up more so than probably most things. However, because statistics can be easily manipulated and distorted, you should make sure to evaluate the statistics very carefully. You want to read the entire article. You don't just want to cherry pick out of an article, because you may ultimately misinterpret what those statistics are really saying. Speakers need to understand the difference among basic statistical measures, which I'm guessing you guys probably do, but just as an overview. The mean is the average of a group of numbers, the median is the middle number in that group of numbers, and the mode is the number that occurs most. I would say generally people expect to have a mean the average of a group. And if you use another statistical measure, then you should mention that it's specifically, if you're using a median, you want to say that that's what you've chosen to do. And with any source, you need to determine whether the statistic comes from a reliable source. Some tips for using statistics effectively: you want to use them to quantify ideas, put numbers on it. Try to use them sparingly, because if you overuse them, people get a little bit bored. It can be a lot more dry. So you want to be, you want to make sure that you don't use those, or I should say overuse those. The source of statistics should be identified in the speech. You want to specifically say where you found it, who wrote the article, etc. We'll get into that a little bit more later in the presentation. Explain the statistics and make them meaningful to the audience and to your topic. If you have complicated statistics, try to round them, or you should round them off. So if you had 1,746,253, round that off to the closest million or the closest 100,000, rather than having all those very small numbers that then can get jumbled up and people don't necessarily really fully appreciate or understand or remember that number. And then statistical trends should be clarified with visual aids. You guys want to make sure that you use visual aids in your presentations, having charts, graphs, things like that. Putting those together in a graphical representation can really help solidify the data that you're presenting, the statistics that you're using. The third kind of supporting material is testimony. Testimony can be highly effective when you use it in a speech, when you use it correctly and you make sure that your source is credible. There are two specific kinds of testimony: expert and peer testimony. Expert testimony comes from people who are acknowledged authorities in their field. So you could consult a professor of psychology if you're writing something about college students, depression in college students, or what have you. Where peer testimony comes from ordinary people who have firsthand experience with the topic. So in that same case, it could be testimony from a person who actually suffers from depression and is a college student. Be sure that you use both of these very cautiously. You want to make sure that they are experts, that they aren't just offering opinions, that it is still factually based. And you could present the testimony in your speech by quoting it specifically or by paraphrasing. Some tips for using testimony effectively: you want to make sure that you quote or paraphrase accurately. You shouldn't change the meaning of what that person has said. If you quote the person, it should be verbatim, word for word, exactly what they've said. As I mentioned, you want to make sure that the testimony is from qualified sources as well as from unbiased sources. And then you should make sure to identify the people that are being quoted or paraphrased within your speech. Excuse me. So when you actually come around to citing your sources orally within your speech, you need to identify the source of your supporting material. Unlike when you actually do this in an essay in written format, you don't need to follow a standard format. So when I say this, ultimately the content of the citation is going to depend on your topic, your audience, your claim, and the kind of supporting material that's being used as to how much information you actually specifically have to offer. And it's going to depend on how much we know, how much credibility you're trying to establish, the topic that you've chosen, etc. But by and large, most citations will include some combination or all of the following elements: the document title, the author or sponsoring organization, the author's qualifications, and then the date on which the document was published or updated. Regardless of which elements are included, you should make sure that you integrate those citations smoothly into your speech. And what does that look like? I have some examples. The first one, we could be presenting on safety within contact sports. So as you're speaking, you could transition by starting to say, parents have growing concerns about the safety of contact sports with good cause. And then here's where we start to ramp up to provide the quote specifically. So here's where we're giving the oral citation. In this case, actually in all the cases, the dates are in bright pink. The source itself or the location is in purple. The author's name is in red, and their authority on this subject is going to be in blue. So in January 2018, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune quoted Chris Nowinski, co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, on the dangers of youth tackle football. And here's the specific quote, as we can see, because we do have the quotation marks. Children, he says, were never intended to be hit in the head 500 times in 3 months every year while their brain is going through incredible development. So here we actually have all 4 elements that could be part of an oral citation. And we've made sure that we have an up-to-date or credible source well, I should say, we do have an up-to-date and credible source. There's also another one where we talk about human smuggling. So as we start to transition smoothly, we might start by saying human smuggling is big business and the US government has made little headway in stopping it. Just ask Scott Hatfield, chief of the Human Smuggling Division at Immigration and Customer Enforcement, who was quoted last month in the Houston Chronicle. Anytime we shut down a smuggling organization, there's always somebody to take their place. So again, we have all 4 elements included. This is testimonial, but we still establish credibility and the recency of that particular quotation. The final example, we have companies are responsible to the call for inclusion of those with disabilities. In fact, the U.S. Department of Labor reports on its website that over 21% of the current labor force is made up of people with disabilities. So in this case, we don't include an author or a date because our source is one of those which doesn't necessarily need it. Usually the U.S. Department of Labor doesn't actually have specific authors, but because of its just overall credibility, we're not really forced to actually give more specific data. And we can also rely on the fact that it is current because this is an organization that is routinely updating their information. So in this case, we wouldn't actually have to have all 4 elements of that particular source, and we would be just fine in terms of credibility. So that is it for this presentation. If you would like more information, excuse me, you'll want to read through chapter 8 in your textbook. And of course, I encourage you to do that no matter what. And thanks so much for listening, you guys.